I'm trading my morning coffee run to spend time with you talking about confidence. I'm Sarah Kuhn, and this is Coffee and Confidence. Another thing that I think is so important that we don't really talk about very much is practicing self-forgiveness. I've been going to this support group recently, and somebody said just a couple of weeks ago, they said, you need to make amends to yourself. And I was like, wow, I'd never heard of that before. I've heard of apologizing to other people, and I've heard of making an amends to other people, but I've never heard of making an amends to yourself. I've read several of Gabby Bernstein's books, and she talks a lot about forgiveness and how you have to forgive yourself for things that you didn't do or things that you wanted to do that didn't work out the way that you thought that they would. It's easy for me to look back at the road not taken, right? I have 3/4 of an engineering degree. What would my life look like if I had finished my engineering degree? What would my life look like if I had stayed in North Carolina rather than moving back to the Midwest? It could be a whole lot different. There were a couple of people that I went out with that I could have gotten married. And so I think about that sometimes. What would it look like if that had worked out differently? There is a possibility that I could be living in England now, and I'm positive that I would not be writing a blog and sitting here talking to you right now if that had happened. It would be a whole different thing. I mentioned that I've been listening to Gary Vee a lot recently. He's a big investor. He's invested in Facebook and Twitter very early on before they went public. He also had the opportunity to invest in Uber. He had the opportunity twice to invest in Uber before they went public, and he turned them down. He said, no, that's not going to work. Like, no. And he says over and over again, if he would have given them the normal $25,000 to $50,000 that he usually gives startup companies, that he would be more wealthy than Elon Musk now, who's like one of the wealthiest people in the world. It's easy to look back, right? And there are a lot of things that I've done that I regret. I had one of my first cars was a 1999 Toyota Corolla, and it was this really pretty color of like, it was a blue color, and in the sun it changed to purple, and it was metallic, so it sparkled. It was this really cute little car that I loved. It was so much fun to drive. But it irritated me that we lived on a dirt road, and I worked on a place that was on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And so the paint was chipping on the front of the hood, and it irritated me, and I just couldn't let it go. And so I was so worried about that like right after I paid the car off, and the car payments were like $110 a month, which was, I mean, super cheap. My car payments now are almost $400 a month. But it was super cheap, and right after I paid it off, I traded it in for a RAV4 that I forget what it was. It's like an 01 or an 02, I think, RAV4, which I hated. I ended up hating that car. It had these cheap leather seats in the front that cracked, and it was so top heavy that I couldn't drive. I like to drive really fast, and I guess aggressively. And that car, you couldn't drive like that because it just didn't move like that. And so I regretted the whole time that I owned that car. And then after I bought that car, I ended up buying a Chevy. I forget what it was. Cobalt, I think. And I hated that car too. So it was like I had this series of cars that I just didn't like. And I always went back to selling that first car. Like, oh, why did I sell that first car? Another thing that I do that I regret a lot, and part of the reason that I sold my first car was because I had this tendency to panic when other people panic. So my mom was panicked about the fact that my car was getting older, and, you know, she's like, you're going to have to pay people to work on it. And I'm like, but I was panicked because she was panicked. And so I bought this car that was newer. The RAV4 was newer and it still had a warranty on it. And I guess that it was probably newer than an '01. It was probably like an '04 and '05 because I think I bought it in '06. So it was still a pretty new car. Um, but I've realized that I do that now. I've just started to realize that that's what's happening is other people panic about something and they're like, we need to fix it right now. It's a massive problem. And then I start panicking. I just like soak up all of their panic and I'm like, okay, like, what are we going to do? What do we do? What do we need to do? One of my friends moved out of Boston last year. She moved to Tennessee and she has this idea that I need to move out of Boston. She's like, you don't want to be close to a big city. You need to move back out to the Midwest, out to the country. My parents have been telling me this for a while too. You know, with everything that's been going on with COVID and all of that stuff, they're like, you shouldn't be close to a lot of people. You need to move. And they have this panicked idea about them, you know, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not really panicked about it. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. We'll see. That's real progress for me because like I said, usually I panic. There are a couple of other things like I mentioned quitting school. I stopped exercising. I was exercising 2 hours a day for like 3 years and I felt better and I looked a lot better. And I regret doing that because once you stop, it's like super hard to start doing it again. So you have a couple of choices when you start looking at regrets, things that you could have done or should have done. You can let it eat you alive. You can worry about it and stress about it and panic about it, or you can choose to forgive yourself. And I mentioned making amends to yourself. This is something that I'm still working on, so I'm not really sure what it looks like for me, but I would challenge you to think about what does that look like to you? What does that mean to you? To me, what I want the most is acceptance. I want to be accepted by other people for all of the things about me, for my personality, for my depression and anxiety, for all of the trials and tribulations that I've been through, for the way that I look, regardless of how that is. So I feel like if that's what I want from the world, then that's what I should give myself as well. So I think making amends to myself looks something like self-acceptance, probably something like radical self-acceptance. I think it's also important for you to give yourself some room to play. You know, we talked about failure being a part of life. We talked about being a perfectionist and trying to be perfect when you're doing something new, when you're making plans. It's helped me so much to not worry about being perfect, to just get it done. Kathy Heller calls it being a B or being a C student. I was always the A student, right? I wanted everything done perfect. I wanted it done on time and I wanted it done ahead of schedule. And if there was bonus opportunity, I was getting the bonus points. I wanted more than 100% in my class as a grade. And there were multiple classes that I got like 120% as my final grade. But when it comes to life, you don't really get a grade, right? You have to make decisions and do the things that you want to do. So I look at when, working on my business, working on my blog, writing books, working on my podcast, there is no final, there's no test. There's just working at something that you love. There's helping people. So why focus on whether you're doing the right thing or the things that don't work, feeling like a failure? It's so much better to think of it as like, okay, I'm just going to be a C student. I'm not worried about my podcast being perfect. I'm just going to get it done. Sometimes I like to record things like on Facebook Live or on Instagram Live, and then I'll download them and use them for my podcast. And some of those videos, when I download them, they have this popping noise in them that like constantly is popping. I don't know why it does that. I can't figure out how to make it not do that. And so for a while I was stressing, going like, well, I can't use the video if it's doing that popping stuff. And then, I heard Kathy Heller say this, like, you need to be a C student. Don't stress over it. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. I mean, I would still listen to it even though if it was popping, if I really wanted to listen to it. I've listened to worse audio on podcasts. So I'm going to try to figure out how to fix it if I can find a way that's not super expensive. But in the meantime, it's just going to have to be popping. I don't know what to say. And when I first started my podcast, I stressed so much about the audio. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to be clear, to not have any type of an echo. There was so much. And for a while, I was editing episodes. I was sitting way too close to the microphone to begin with, which I didn't realize because I had never recorded audio before. So you could hear me breathing, like when you're talking, every time you pause to take a breath, it sounded like, and it would just like irritated me so bad. So I spent hours learning how to use an audio editing software, and I cut out all of those noises. And then people started making comments that my podcast sounded weird because you couldn't hear me breathing. And I was like, does it sound, I thought it sounded better, but maybe people think I guess people think it sounds weird. So maybe just don't stress about it. Like, why spend hours editing it if it sounds worse when you're putting so much effort into it? So for me, I've just realized that, failure is a part of the process, not to be so perfectionistic about everything, and just give myself more room to play and say, hey, we're just going to try this and see what happens. Call it a trial period, call it a beta launch, just stop expecting everything to be perfect, and realize that that's not really how life is. That failure is a part of it, and it's totally fine if something happens that feels like a failure, and to stop judging yourself so harshly. You'll realize that once you turn that perfectionism around in your head, that you'll feel so much better about it, and you'll feel more confident because you're not judging yourself so much. Hi there. I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Please consider subscribing to my channel. I'm working very hard to produce content that will help you, and I really, really appreciate your support. Also, if you want some more inspiration, check out this video right here.